Hi, and welcome to Mental Health, the Up&Up. I'm Anna, your host, and we are here talking with Geraldine Peterson, licensed mental health counselor, to give you the Up&Up on mental health with ideas that are clear, helpful, and maybe even fun. We'll be talking about general wellness as well as specifics about anxiety, depression, parenting, communication, a whole lot more. I'll be asking questions, so the point of this show is that I'm learning right along with you, the audience. Geraldine, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Geraldine. I've been a therapist for over 25 years. I've worked with children, teens, adults, couples and families, individuals, groups, and classes. The people I've worked with have shared with me the ideas that worked best for them, and I'm here to share those ideas with you. A quick disclaimer before we get started. I'm a therapist, but this isn't therapy. These are just ideas for you to think about on your own or to talk about with your own therapist.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to dive right in with the basics. So, what I really wanted to talk about today, Jerry, was counseling itself. What is counseling? What is the point of going to counseling? Why do we even bother?
So, you want Counseling 101 in 10 minutes or less.
Of course.
There is a basic concept that does take about 10 or so minutes to kind of explain reasonably that just about every therapist keeps in mind when they're doing therapy, regardless of what kind of therapist you go see or their style or your learning style or what you're working on. So that's what I'm going to do my best to kind of explain. And that idea is very simply that everybody has thoughts going through their head. Everybody has feelings going through whatever feelings go through. And everybody has behavior. So we think things, we feel things, and we do things. And those three things, thinking, feeling, and doing, are all related to each other. They don't control each other, but they affect each other. So if I wake up one morning and I don't know why, but for whatever reason, I wake up and I feel depressed, that feeling is going to push my thoughts. It's not going to control my thoughts, but it's really going to push my thoughts pretty hard to think about, maybe every disappointment I've had in my life and every friend who's let me down and every goal I've wanted to achieve that I haven't achieved yet. So that feeling of depression doesn't force those thoughts, but it makes it super easy to think of kind of real depressing, negative thoughts. If I feel depressed and I'm pushed to feel all those negative thoughts, but I say, hold on, wait a minute. I'm going to try to think about 5 positive things in my life, or I'm going to try to remember, 3 times that friends have been there for me and haven't let me down, or I'm going to make a list of the goals that I've set and I have achieved. If we feel depressed and we kind of can't break out of that feeling, but we change our thoughts and we start thinking about goals we've achieved and friends who've supported us and, positive things in life, then those thoughts in return are going to push on that feeling and make it easier for us to feel happy rather than depressed. So the feeling affects the thoughts and the thoughts affect the feeling. Is that making sense, Anna?
That's making sense, yeah.
Okay. So if another morning I wake up and I'm not feeling depressed, but I start to think about every goal I've had that I haven't accomplished and every friend who's let me down and, everything I want that I don't have. And I start thinking those things, pretty soon I'll probably be feeling depressed. So it can start with feelings and affect thoughts. It can start with thoughts and affect feelings. And it can be kind of shifted in either way. If we change our feelings, that's going to change our thoughts. If we change our thoughts, that's going to change our feelings. So it's kind of like a positive snowball effect. Once you change your thoughts, that makes it easier to change your feelings. As you change your feelings, that makes it easier to change your thoughts in a positive way.
Okay.
So that's just feelings and thoughts. And I promise you that may sound simple now, but it's going to get fairly complicated before we get done, but still easy to understand. We also have behaviors. So that morning I wake up feeling depressed. And I think all these depressing thoughts about disappointments and being let down. Those feelings and those thoughts are going to push on my behavior. Again, not control my behavior, but it's going to push my behavior to pull the covers over my head and hit the snooze bar 37 times. And maybe when I do get up, I eat, 6 donuts for breakfast. If I pull the covers over my head and eat a bunch of sugar and hit the snooze bar, I'm going to be feeling more depressed, and I'm going to be thinking, oh, I can't even get out of bed. So that behavior affects my thoughts and affects my feelings. So that morning when I wake up feeling depressed, if I say, okay, I'm going to write down 5 positive things, and it's just too hard, I can't do it. If I say, okay, that's not working for me, so instead of that, I'm going to get out of bed, I'm going to turn on a warm shower, I'm going to use some really pretty smelling soap or shampoo, and I'm going to turn on my favorite music. Those things, getting into a hot shower instead of eating, a dozen donuts, turning on your favorite music instead of pulling the covers over your head. Those behaviors are going to make it easier to improve our feelings, make it easier to not feel as depressed, and that behavior is going to make it easier for us to then think about, life isn't so bad. I haven't always been disappointed. I have achieved some of my goals. So a real basic idea in therapy is that cycle and that interaction of thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And some people come into counseling or therapy because of feelings they're having. They're depressed, they're anxious. In therapy, you and your therapist will probably talk about those feelings, but you may also talk about the thoughts that go along with those feelings, or the behavior that comes before or comes during or comes after those feelings. Because your therapist understands that if you can't change your feelings of depression or anxiety or whatever feeling you don't, or anger, it might be easier to change those feelings if we work on changing the thoughts first. Or it might be easier to change those feelings if we work on the behavior first. So, yeah. So regardless of why you come into counseling, probably you'll end up addressing all 3 of those things at some point. And different therapists start at different places. You may want to start at different places. You can tell your therapist, it's really hard for me to change my thoughts, but I think I can work on my behavior. That would be an easier place to start. But eventually all 3 of those are going to end up being involved. So does that make sense as kind of like a general concept for what therapy, what you actually do in the room when you get to therapy?
For sure. Yeah. That's a pretty closed cycle, but it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said it's closed cycle, because that's the real basic idea behind therapy. If we all were just individuals and lived on an island and all we had was our thoughts, feelings, and behavior, and we didn't have to do this thing, called life. So, right? So the other thing that therapists may talk about and that influences this cycle of thoughts, feelings, and behavior is our relationships with other people. We interact with other people all the time. And every other person has their own little cycle of thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So I'll use you and me as an example. Anna, if you had a fight with your husband and then you and I started doing a podcast and that fight with your husband made you feel like agitated and frustrated, and then you and I get on the podcast and you say, Geraldine, let's get started, in like a kind of agitated voice, that's going to affect my thoughts, feelings, and behavior. I might think, oh my goodness, is she mad at me? I might think, uh-oh, or I might do something different. I might say, oh, I'm not going to ask her about anything right now. I'm just going to sit here and do the podcast and not ask her any personal questions, and I might feel worried or anxious or angry, depending on how I interpret that. So
For sure.
Your husband affected my behavior and I didn't even talk to him.
Right.
So, and that happens that happens all the time in different relationships. A stranger walking down the street can glare at us, and we think, oh my God, even strangers, you think I'm a bad person, but maybe that person walking down the street was thinking that, but probably not. Maybe they were thinking, I have something in my eye, or maybe they were remembering something negative that happened 5 minutes ago to them. But other people's thoughts, feelings, and behavior affect our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And again, that can get, as you can imagine, that can get pretty complicated pretty fast, because your husband's cycle of thoughts, feelings, and behavior affect your cycle of thoughts, feelings, and behavior that affect my cycle of thoughts, feelings, and behavior that maybe affect my family's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So it can.
There's actually there's a Norman Rockwell painting that's exactly that. Where it shows the man getting yelled at by his boss, and he comes home and yells at his wife because the darning wasn't done on his socks, and she yells at the boy, and the boy yells at the dog, and it goes on. It shows that exact cycle.
Yes, that's funny because she didn't darn his socks. That shows you how the era of Norman Rockwell, which
very
is
much.
Yes, but that idea is true. That the dog has a bad day because of a behavior that a boss had, or a feeling that the dad had, or a reaction that the mom had.
Snowball.
So, yeah, for sure. Tangled snowball. There's got to be another analogy there, because a snowball sounds almost too clean
That's
for
true.
this example.
A yarn ball that's fallen through the snow and 5 piles of mud.
I love it. The yarn ball effect. Yeah. So, getting back to counseling and away from Norman Rockwell paintings. Excuse me. In therapy, sometimes your counselor will bring up relationships. Who are you around when you're feeling depressed? Who are you around that makes it easy for you to feel happier or more centered? What can other people do to comfort you? What behavior can you ask other people to do to help with your feelings? What behavior can you ask other people to do to help with your thoughts? So we have thoughts, feelings, and behavior, which are all about us. And then we have relationships that, again, push those thoughts, feelings, and behavior, but don't control them. Because, Anna, you could have had a fight with your husband and you glare at me and I'm there like, well, she's glaring. I don't care. Not that I don't care about you, but
no,
I can take that thought and say, yeah, Anna's having a bad day. It's not that she doesn't like me. She's having a bad day. So I don't have control over Anna and her husband, over you and your husband fighting. I certainly don't. I wasn't even there, but I can control to some degree my reaction to it, my feelings about it, what I think of it. Mm-hmm. And therapy is about looking at those things too. How do we respond when to someone else's thoughts, feelings, and behavior?
Okay.
So the yarn ball gets more complicated.
Okay.
And another thing, besides everything we've been talking about, Another thing that sometimes your therapist and you will talk about is things outside of yourself that affect your thoughts, feelings, and behavior, the stressors in your life. And Anna, one of my favorite questions, and I'm going to ask you this because it's one of my favorite questions.
Okay.
If you won the lottery, $800,000, well, that's not enough, $8 million,
Oh my.
would winning the lottery change your thoughts, feelings, and behavior even a little bit for even a little while?
Yeah. Yeah, I could
Yeah,
have to say it would.
yeah. For most people, it would. You would at least go on a shopping spree, or stop
Right.
worrying so much about can I make rent this month, and feel at least a little bit excited or surprised. Um, I wish that that were the cure for depression, as everybody wins $8 million in the lottery. Probably not going to happen. But you can see how outside events can affect that cycle of thoughts, feelings, and behavior.
For sure.
Another example is something as uncontrollable by us as the weather. I live in Washington State, where it rains a good third of the year. And just about February in Washington State, I can kind of see almost everybody getting a little grumpy because we've had, 60 days and only 2 of them has it not rained.
Yeah.
So the weather can affect our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And a kind of clinical example of that is seasonal affective disorder that a lot of people may have heard of. It's called SAD, appropriately so. And that's the idea or the reality that some people in wintertime, when there's less sunlight, they become depressed. And then in the summertime, when there's more sunlight, the depression kind of goes away for a while. And then the next winter, it comes back because of the angle of the earth, right? So you probably can't control winning the lottery, and I'm pretty sure you can't control the angle of the earth.
I don't think that's in my wheelhouse, no.
But those outside events do affect our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And even if we can't control those outside events, we can control, again, our thoughts or our feelings or our behavior when those outside events happen. So, again, in Washington State, I think every single person at sometime in February should be given a free vacation to the Bahamas. I think that would clear up a whole bunch of mental health issues. If you can't go to the Bahamas in the middle of February, there's probably some behavior you can change or some thinking you can change. A lot of times in Washington, um, people think, well, the rain is what makes Washington so green and makes the flowers bloom. And if we think about rain in a different way, then it doesn't affect us as much. And I'll tell you something different about Washington, too, that people not from Washington think is weird, is in Washington, we tend to think, rain just doesn't affect us. So people in Washington tend to not use umbrellas. Everywhere, every other, state in the United States, it rains, people pull out their umbrellas. In Washington State, it kind of rains so much that where they're like, oh, this is just what it does. And I'm going to go outside and walk in the rain.
Right.
So if we can't control the rain or the angle of the sun or winning the lottery, we can try to change our thoughts, feelings, and behavior in response to those things.
Okay.
Sometimes we can change those things outside of us. And the example I use is when I started my private practice, my office was painted a kind of dark yellowy brown, and it was just dismal. And that's
That
the room I
sounds
sat
dismal.
in all day. It was, I called it poop brown. It was, it was just the ugliest brown ever.
Mm.
I sat in that room all day. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who's a therapist and saying, oh, I just hate the walls. And you know what? When I have the money and the time, I'm going to paint those walls a different color. And my friend said, you know what? I'd paint them now. And I did. I painted those walls probably the next week into a kind of peachy pink, which is much more pleasant for me to sit in all day. And it definitely made it easier for me to keep a positive attitude and an optimistic viewpoint and to not get depressed myself and to think different, just think more positively.
Which then affects your behaviors, which affects all your clients. So this is a beautiful thing.
Which affects my client. Exactly. So a can of paint and 4 hours of my work, probably took me longer than that, but 4 hours and a little bit of time investment changed a lot for me. And you're right, for my clients and then for my clients' families and friends.
Exactly.
So in counseling again, and I use counseling and therapy interchangeably here. Different people call it different things, including different professionals will sometimes refer to themselves as a therapist, sometimes refer to themselves as a counselor. But sometimes in therapy, you'll talk about those triggers or stressors that affect your thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And what is a big stressor that's affecting your thoughts, feelings, and behavior? And can we change that stressor? And if we can't change that stressor, what can we change so it doesn't have such a dramatic negative effect on you? Another huge example of this is like in the addiction recovery community, it's very triggering to go back to the places that you used. That can affect your thoughts, feelings, and behavior, and you can have cravings. And so they say, don't go back to those places. There's nothing magical about those places except for that person's own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors when they were in that place before.
Yeah.
So don't go back to that place, or don't hang around the same people. Do different activities. So again, we look in counseling, you'll look at things outside of you, good and bad, that affect your thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Change the ones you can. If you can't change them, figure out a way to change your thoughts, feelings, and behavior about them so they don't have as much effect on you.
Okay.
All right. Is it getting pretty complicated and intermingled here? Intertangled?
It's definitely a messy yarn ball.
So we started with the simple thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And I say simple, but that takes a little time to wrap your head around. Oh, yeah. When I feel this way, it's easier for me to act a certain way. And when I think these things, it tends to make me feel a certain way. We added in relationships, everybody else's triangle of thoughts, feelings, and behavior. We added in outside stressors or triggers.
Yep.
Another thing, and this is the last one we'll talk about, there's other ones, but I think these are the basics. The other thing that affects that whole cycle is things inside of us. The weather is outside of us, but there's conditions inside of us that affect our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And those are things that are different between you and me, Anna, even though we're sitting in the same room. Or even if we were sitting in the same room. So most of us are familiar with the term hangry, so hungry that you're angry. And hunger is a physical condition. That's something inside of you. So if you and I are sitting in a room and you're hungry and I'm not, I've just had a great meal and you're hungry, and my neighbor starts barbecuing outside and the scent of that barbecue is just floating into the room where we're sitting. I'm not going to be distracted. I'm not even going to pay attention. You're probably going to get really distracted, not be able to pay attention. You're going to feel cravings. You're going to think, oh, what should I have for lunch after I talk with Geraldine? Simply because you're hungry and I'm not.
Right.
So that's a real simple example of that. But that's also where in therapy or with prescribers, people talk about things like your serotonin level can affect your thoughts, feelings, and behavior, how much sleep you get, how your brain connects. Like people with ADHD, their brain just works a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where kind of medications and things like that come into therapy. And it's one part of it. It's not the whole thing, but it's definitely an influence. If you're low on vitamin D, it's really hard to have energy.
Yeah.
So you can fight it, or you can take vitamin D, or you can do both.
Right.
The other things that are different, that tend to be different in people, even though they're sitting in the same room, is our memories. And again, in therapy, a lot of people think of that as, bringing up the past, bringing up past trauma.
Mm.
But kind of like what I talked about when I talked about substance abuse recovery, those memories do affect our thoughts, feelings, and behavior.
Yeah.
So the example I use is that if I were bitten by a dog when I was a kid and it was horrible and I remember the pain and all that, and you've had dogs you've loved all your life, you just always had these wonderful dogs in your life that you played with and comforted you and were just a big part of your life. And you and I are sitting side by side in the same room, and a dog walks into the room. My thoughts, feelings, and behavior are going to be very different than yours because our memories are different.
True.
It's this,
yeah.
It's the same dog, it's the same trigger or outside event, but my thoughts and feelings and behavior are going to be, I'm going to feel afraid. I'm going to think of where I can run away from that dog, or where can I go so that dog isn't going to attack me? And I might leave the room. I might jump up on the desk. I might back up.
Yeah.
Your thoughts are going to be very different. Your thoughts are going to be, oh, what a cute little pup, what a cute little doggy. And you're going to start, scratching the doggy's belly, and you're going to feel all warm and fuzzy.
Mm-hmm.
Simply because our memories are different. Same dog.
Yep.
We usually can't change our memories, but we can work on changing our thoughts and feelings and behavior around those memories. So in the kind of real simple example of being afraid of dogs, I can start to play with puppies, or I can change that behavior so that memory doesn't affect me as strongly. The memory of getting bitten by a dog doesn't affect me as strongly.
Mm-hmm.
Or I can remind myself that was a particular dog who, the whole neighborhood knew was vicious and shouldn't have been left off there, shouldn't have been let outside,
Yeah.
But most dogs aren't like that, and most dog owners are responsible, and I can start to try to feel safer around dogs, so that memory doesn't change. I just kind of overlay it with new memories.
More information or new memories, yeah.
Exactly, more information. So a lot of times in counseling, therapists do bring up your past. They do say, what happened as a child that reminds you of what you're going through now. Not because we love to just talk about negative memories, but because we realize that those memories do still have an impact on our today's thoughts, feelings, and behavior.
Yeah,
And
they influence your perspective.
Yeah. And what can we change? We can't change the memory, but what can we change so that memory doesn't have as much power over you?
I think it's also important to note, because memories do influence our perspective and our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings. I think it's important to note, especially if you're going to counseling for relationship help, that even if you're struggling with a relationship with someone who you have common experience with, that doesn't mean you have common memories with. And so that could explain a lot of conflict. Because I'm just thinking about just me and my siblings. We all grew up in the exact same house with the same parents, everything. But we have very different outlooks on life just as adults because we have a different perspective on those memories that we both share.
Yeah.
Something about the information is just informed different because we're different people. And so I can see how that adds to the complexity of our yarn ball.
Yeah, exactly. Or even if you're currently experiencing the same thing. There's a scene from a movie, I think it's Parenthood, where it shows two people riding on a roller coaster, sitting side by side in the same car. And one person is like terrified and looks nauseous and, just having a horrible time. And the other person is like smiling ear to ear and leaning forward. Yeah. And it's because of their perspective of what's going on. It's, again, the same outside thing. It's the same roller coaster. They're sitting side by side. But because of what, their past or their perspective, their other thoughts, feelings, and behavior, whether they ate, a corn dog right before getting on the roller coaster, is it's going to affect their thoughts, feelings, and behavior as they ride that roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
So the last thing before we wrap up that I'll talk about is our value system. That is also something very different, even though people might be sitting in the same room. So if I'm an avid hunter and you're a vegan, you won't even eat honey because it comes from animals. And you and I are walking through the woods and we see a deer, same outside event, very different thoughts, feelings, and behavior. I'm going to pull out my rifle, and I'm not an avid hunter, so I don't know if you hunt deer with rifle even. I'm going to pull out my gun. I'm going to say, yum, here's dinner. And I'm going to feel, super excited. And you're going to feel all warm and fuzzy and think, oh, Bambi, how cute, and maybe, tiptoe, try to get a little closer to the deer. Again, because our values are different.
Mm-hmm.
We usually don't want to change our values, but our value systems definitely affect that whole yarn snowball. And values are absolutely something you can talk about in counseling that can help you shift that cycle to a pattern that works better for you. So basically, counseling is about, regardless of why you come into it, it's about changing what you can about those things so that your cycle of thoughts, feelings, and behavior and your relationship and your environment and your internal workings just serve you better.
Okay.
And again, different counselors may start at different places. Some counselors really start on your thoughts about things. Counselors, more like art therapy counselors or dance therapy or equine therapy, are going to focus more on changing your feelings, helping you feel safe, and then working on the thoughts and behavior. And behavioral therapists are going to work first on behavior. Eventually, all those things are going to end up being affected. So sometimes therapy can feel disjointed, or you walk out of therapy and say, I don't even know why we talked about that. It's because we're looking to find places, little places to change that then can affect that whole cycle.
Okay.
And I kind of like the idea of the yarn ball because I sometimes compare that whole messy interaction of all those things like a big knot. So it's a knotted up yarn ball in the snow. So when you're trying to untie a knot, you don't start at the left and move to the right. You kind of pull and tug at it until you find something that loosens, and you work on that little piece. And maybe you're working on that piece and it doesn't loosen, it tightens something up somewhere else. And then you stop working on that piece and you move to a different section of the knot.
Yeah.
And therapy can feel disjointed because sometimes therapy can feel disjointed because sometimes it is like that. It is disjointed. We're kind of grabbing at the knot at different places to loosen it up and to start to untangle that knot. So that's the basic idea that most therapists keep in mind when you go into therapy. And then if you're already in therapy, you'll probably notice that that's what your therapist is doing. That sometimes they're talking about what's happening outside of you when you have a panic attack. And sometimes they'll talk about what are you thinking when you're having a panic attack. Mm-hmm. And it's all because those are all so interconnected. And therapy is just about untangling all those interconnections so we can see them better and connect them in a way that works better for us.
Sounds like a worthy goal.
That's
I know I could
goal.
Definitely use some of that.
And life gets tangled very quickly.
It does. It really does.
Yeah.
So as a follow-up question that will also lead us into our next segment for next week, the big question is, now that we know what counseling is, how do we find a counselor? What does that process look like? Where do we go? How do we even start?
Yeah.
And that's a big overarching question, but maybe we can short cap it and then we can explain more in the next episode.
I break that down into two sections. One section is the very practical part of where do I find a counselor that my insurance company accepts and that maybe does telehealth if I want telehealth, or it lives close to my work or between my work and home, so it's convenient for sessions. So the real practical part of how to find a therapist that works with what's going on in your life. And then the second part of that is how to find a therapist that's a good match for you. A therapist who, if you want to focus most on behavior, maybe how to find a behavioral therapist, someone who focuses more on behavior. If you're someone who loves art and gets in touch with their feelings through that, how to find someone who's familiar with art therapy. And even in talk therapy, which is what most therapists do, is they sit and talk with you, how to find someone where the conversation feels comfortable, you feel respected, you feel heard, and you feel helped. So there's a real practical part of it, like literally how to find, I was going to say in the yellow pages, which is really showing how old I am, how to find that any therapist. And then secondly, how to find a therapist that's a good fit for you. So that can take up a whole other
couple episodes.
Yeah, I could probably.
All right. So that's a really good breakdown. I like that you address the finding a therapist that works with you the best, because just like the rest of us, therapists are people too, and sometimes we work better with some people than others, and that's just a fact of life. And it's important to know that, and it's not a diss against anyone.
No, and therapists actually appreciate it. If you're not working well with them, they would rather you find someone who helps you better. They don't want it to be any more difficult than it is, because therapy can be difficult and upsetting.
For more information, visit our website, www.upandupwellness.com. We have blogs, we have videos, we have resources to help you in your mental health wellness journey. The link will be in the bio. Also, just a note that we want to make sure everyone knows, if you are in crisis, the National Mental Health Helpline is 988, and you can call it whether you are in a crisis big or small. So once again, the crisis line, if you are needing it, is 988. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.